Why is it that when someone on the REZ commits suicide, a family member or someone close to the person always says they saw some dark spirits or some shadows beforehand? I heard the same scenario every time it happens out here. Someone sees some dark shadows or demon-like figures before tragedy strikes. My father one time saw that dark shadow while hunting. He felt a dark and sinister presence along the road, a black shadow that left him just feeling strange. The next morning, he found his brother hanging from a tree. My dad has shared the story with many people, and he's also heard similar accounts. Many have experienced the same thing. Maybe it's a sign of mental illness, but I believe dark influences play a role. No one takes their own life without some kind of influence pushing them towards it. Now, have you ever come across a shadow being? Many people have, but they are often afraid to talk about it. If you are American, I dare you to ask any indigenous person about what a black shadow is. Chances are, they might not tell you. I think everyone will mention one thing though. They do exist. They follow drugs and alcohol. They can linger through generations, attaching themselves to someone and remaining there, passing from one person to the next. It's not that they're out looking for someone just taking a sip of alcohol, or someone who is just, quote unquote, experimenting lightly. I'm referring to the people who are using these things to drown out their pain and forget their lives. They follow this because they feed off of bad energy, and in the REZ, well, there's a lot of bad medicine, witchcraft, and bad energy scattered throughout. Of course, I'm not saying that the REZ is just full of this, but out here, there is a lot of that. You'll be surprised by the things that I've seen, and all the stories I heard about how drugs have infested the REZ. I have seen and experienced these things myself, and I have learned that the only way to get rid of this is through some heavy ceremonies to break their hold. I had many encounters with these shadows, with the shadow person, or shadow beings. Some people might call them demons or evil spirits. I'm not sure what they are, but I have gone to a ceremony where an elder has done a cleansing. But that was a while back. I want to share this with you. One of the things that the medicine man told me before the ceremony was to write down everything that I can remember about these things. Something about finding the root, or understanding the origin. From all of my encounters, there is one that stands out, and it lingers in the back of my mind. Throughout my life, I have encountered many things that I can't explain, that I don't want to experience again. I'm not sure if it's an ongoing pattern in my life, or I just happen to be at the right place at the wrong time. Or maybe I'm just sensitive to what is happening around me. If I am sensitive, I must be extremely sensitive to these things. In 2005, I started volunteering at our local radio station here on the REZ. Back then, a friend of mine, he was a DJ. He asked me to come up and answer his phone calls for him while he was on the air in the evenings. I agreed to it and started answering the phone calls for him. It was a fun experience, talking to people on the phone who wanted to hear a song, or if they asked about the weather, or whatever else was happening at that moment. So it was a summer evening, on a Monday. I can't remember the exact day, but what happened that evening is something that I still remember like it happened last night. We were in Studio A, the main broadcast studio at that time. My friend was on the air doing his show, and I was beside him answering the phone as people called in. It was a summer evening. The sun was still out, but it was slowly going down. There was also no AC, so we left the front door and lobby door open so it could be somewhat cool in the radio station. The air conditioning was an on and off type of deal. Sometimes it worked, some other times it didn't. It wasn't working that night, so we were doing our best to try to cool off. It was around 7:30 when we decided to take a break. For him it was a smoke break. While he was queuing up the songs, I got up to use the bathroom. The bathroom is towards the back of the offices and lobby, but before the little kitchen area. I was walking towards the bathroom, and as I came around the corner, I saw something go by the window outside. It was a man wearing dark clothes, and what I thought was a hoodie. It was pulled over his head. I thought that was crazy considering the heat that we had during the day, but as it walked by, it slowly turned its head towards me. The hairs on the back of my neck and arms stood up, and this fear came over me. My first thought was, shit, not again. I looked at it as it stood by the window, and then it walked away from the window, and the fear was gone. My rational side took over, and I thought it was my friend playing a joke on me. I turned around and went back to the studio, and he was sitting there. He hadn't even left. I looked at him and then towards the front door. Something about the way I looked must have made him curious, because he did ask me, "What is it?" I didn't know how to respond to him about what I just saw and felt, so I told him I just saw someone outside walking around the building. My friend got up, and we both went outside onto the deck. Part of me being at the station means doing random security checks around the building, and so we did one. We went around to the east side of the building and around to the back where the tower was at. I went to the west side of the building, and I waited for him to come around. He never came around, so I went back to the front of the building, and so we met up on the deck. He asked me what I saw, because the station sits on the side of a hill and the only place to hide is behind the station. I'm not sure how to explain it at first, so it took a while to tell him what I saw. I told him that when I went to the bathroom, I saw a dark hooded figure walk by, and then it stopped and looked in at me. I told him about how the hairs on my neck and arms went up when I saw it. He looked at me and gave me a look that made me think he didn't believe me. Then he said that things happen there from time to time. He has felt some things but never seen anything like what I told him. We said a prayer and went back inside. When we got back inside, he told me to let him know if I saw it again. I tried shaking off the fear that I had, but it wouldn't go away. It stayed with me. My friend and I went back to doing what we were doing. He got on the radio, and I answered the phones once again. It was after sundown, and it was still light outside when I felt it. The hair immediately went up again on the right side of my body, out of the corner of my eye. I could see it, standing there at the front door. The hood over its head was above the top of the door, and it was bending down to look at me. I could feel that. I turned in my chair to look at it, and as I did, it disappeared. But for some reason, I knew it was still there. I turned back towards my friend, and there it was again in the corner of my eye. I signaled him that it was back. I then said the following words to him silently. "It's at the front door." He was talking on the microphone, so all he could do was nod at me. He was doing a station ID, and that took about 2 minutes. I could still see it standing there in the doorway, but as I turned to look at my friend again, the hair went up on my arms and neck. I saw it walk in and stand by the inner door out of the corner of my eye. The lobby door is 20 feet away from where I was sitting at. I tapped on the table quickly. He looked at me. "It's at the lobby door," I mouthed to him. As I turned towards the lobby door, I expected it to disappear like it did before, but I could see it. A full body silhouette was standing at the lobby door. The black hood was over its eyes, but I could feel it staring at me. The first thing that came to my mind, I waved it, yelling in my head, "Get out." That made my friend jump as he was still reading the station ID. I looked at him quickly and turned back to the lobby door. As I did, the black shadow transformed into a wispy black cloud, and then it disappeared as it went towards the kitchen area. As I said, that was the longest, scariest, heart-pounding 2 minutes in my life. For the second time in my life, I had seen something like that. I was still looking towards the lobby area when I saw out of the corner of my eye that my friend was done, and he started up the music again. He gave me that "what the fuck" look. Then he asked, "What was that?" I told him that I didn't know. He went on to say that even though he was on the air, he couldn't see it, but he felt whatever it was. We both got up and went into the lobby. That intense feeling of something bad was still there. He asked me where it went. I told him it went towards the kitchen area. He looked at me, and without saying anything, we both went walking towards the kitchen. The feeling we had was going away fast, and when we got to the kitchen area, it was gone. My friend has moved on to other things in his life. As I write this, I am wondering if that's the reason why they moved the studio around a few months after that. Studio A back then faced the lobby, front door, and a side door leading to the transmitter. Studio A is now what used to be Studio B. It's a lot smaller and doesn't directly face the front door. I can still see out into the lobby, but not the front door. I still see things happen here and there. I sometimes hear things on my own, but I have never encountered that dark shadow since the ceremony was done. Also, just an FYI, I disagree with those stories and people that think that these dark things come only at night. I know for a fact that they don't. I've seen some other things here, but they aren't like what I saw that night. Even writing all of this makes me feel sort of weird. It actually makes the hair on my neck and arms stand up, and it puts a little fear in me. So I'll just end the story like this and not speak on this again. I do smudge and keep old medicine from the elders in my room, and I think this has truly helped me. Look for help if you ever do see a dark shadow, especially if it's a silhouette of a person. I'm using a burner account here, simply because I don't feel comfortable sharing it from my main account. I do want to share this experience that I had about 9 to 10 years ago, and the reason I'm sharing this is to see if anyone has a similar experience, or maybe an idea of what this could have been. Before I start, I have told the story to plenty of people, friends and family. I have told them about this whenever supernatural or scary stuff has come up in the conversation, but I have always left out the finer details on purpose. To be honest, I think I still have some trauma from it. I don't like going too much into detail about this, or reliving this experience again. Instead, I have only ever told this as a short story to get a reaction. It's most likely a coping mechanism. My girlfriend is the only person I have ever told the full story. And just to be clear, I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything here. You can believe what you want, and I respect your opinion. But I'm also not going to argue or debate over something that I know to be true. This experience happened when I was wild camping on my own, in a forest. I live in England, by the way, near the Welsh border. This is something that I've done many times, and I still continue to do to this day. I think it was April or May 2013, or 2014. The weather was unseasonably good, and this was the second of 3 nights that I planned for my trip, even though it ended up being the last. The first night and second day had been great. I got a lovely long hike in, followed by lunch at the pub. I drove back to the area that I was staying in, and I was now back in my tent. I settled down for the night. I read a book and had some beers and went to sleep. It was around 11 p.m. at midnight. I was just in a state where you're semi-conscious, about to drift off but haven't quite just yet. I slowly became aware of this noise, somewhere outside the tent. It didn't sound that close, maybe like 50 feet. It sounded like a person, perfectly humming a tune. After listening for a couple of minutes, it was definitely somebody humming a tune. When I say perfectly, I mean just that. It sounded like a professional singer or something because it was perfectly in tune. No voice breaks or anything at all. I can't remember whether it sounded like a man or a woman. At this point I'm shitting myself because it's just incredibly creepy, like something from a horror film. I hadn't left my tent at this point, and the humming also hadn't gotten louder. It just stayed a distant background noise. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't just stay there forever. So I mustered up the courage to open my tent as slowly and quietly as I could, to see if I could see anything or tell where the noise was coming from. Within 5 seconds of me poking my head out of the tent, the humming stopped. It didn't fade away or anything. It just stopped dead, as if someone had pressed pause on a recording. I'm still very on edge at this point, but at the time I assumed that's just what it is. Someone playing a prank on solo campers with an audio recording. I really couldn't think of any other explanation. Based on that assumption, I shouted something like, "You're not funny, fuck off." That made me feel a bit better because it felt like I had addressed the issue. I'm not sure why. It actually helped my nerves a bit at that time. I let that hang in the air for like 10 more seconds while my head is still poking out of the tent. And it stays quiet. I'm kinda satisfied by this point, so I began moving back in. As I'm reaching for the 10 zipper though, the humming starts again. The same tune, but much louder, much closer, and from the completely opposite direction. My heart completely sinks because there is no way someone could have moved from the first source of the noise to the second without me seeing or hearing something. It was impossible. It was perfectly quiet in the woods too, not even any breeze against the leaves. And yeah, it was dark, but I could still see short distances thanks to the moonlight. In the back of my mind though, my subconscious is working overtime, trying to rationalize this, and I assumed that there were a few pranksters out there with a few audio recordings. I can't exactly remember what my thought process was at this point, but for one reason or another, I got up out of the tent, turned towards the noise ready to scream at whoever it was. That's when I saw this humanoid figure, silhouetted against the tree line, maybe about 15 feet away from me. My best description of this is, it was large, a thin figure that was shaped like a human, but way too tall, and proportioned all wrong. It was huge, I guess over 7 feet. Its limbs were unnaturally long, like it had been stretched out. Its head appeared very small and rounded. I think the figure was gray in color, but I can't be 100% sure. I couldn't make out much of its face at all. It just seemed to be shrouded in shadow. I definitely didn't notice any features like eyes, mouth, or nose. It was standing quite still, facing directly at me. I did say quite still, because there was some movement, in the same way that a person or animal would sway back and forth, or make some minor body movements. If they were standing up, that is. This was a real, living thing. I know that for a fact. Not a prop or a prank. This thing was standing right in front of me, and it was aware of my presence. I'm literally paralyzed by fear at this point. I have never felt anything like it before, or since. Just fear that has left me cold, shaking, just standing there quite literally unable to move. I remember thinking that I needed to get away, but I could not physically move my body. It was the most terrified I ever been. As I first laid eyes on this creature, the humming stopped, and immediately it started humming again, but not a song. This is gonna sound crazy, but it started softly singing my name. Not only this, but in what sounded like my voice. That sounds fucking crazy, I know, but I swear, that's how I remember it. Even though it was singing in my voice, it still didn't sound right. The syllables were just off, as though a non-human heard speech once and was trying to copy it for the first time. This couldn't have gone on for more than 10 seconds, but it felt like forever. Me standing there, this creature standing, motionless, and singing my name. At some point, every cell in my body just switched, and I was able to turn and run as fast as I ever have in the opposite way. For maybe 2 minutes, I was literally running through the woods in just my socks and PJs, with absolutely no other thought in my mind other than putting distance between myself and that thing. I had no idea which way I was going, or how I would even make it back to my tent. When I eventually stopped, I just leaned against a tree. The forest was still completely silent. I must have stayed by that tree for about 2 hours, waiting for my heart rate to settle down, trying to calm down and decide what to do. I didn't want to go back to my tent. I was quite happy to leave all my stuff at this point, but I needed my phone and my car keys to get home. I was several miles away from anywhere. I eventually made my way back slowly. It wasn't too hard to navigate back to my tent in those woods, because the tree distribution wasn't very dense. I also realized I hadn't gone as far as I first feared. Once back at my tent, I grabbed just my phone and keys and went back to my car as fast as I was comfortable. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the backseat on my phone, shaking. I didn't even try to get any sleep. Once the sun was up, I was able to go back and pack my stuff up, and I left as quickly as I could. After that, I took a 2-year break from solo camping. something I normally do every 3 to 4 months. I suppose it didn't do anything towards me, given its size. I'm confident that if it wanted to harm me, it would have. So on that basis, maybe it was just curious. I did feel like I was in danger at that time, but most likely it was because of fear. The only thing that I have that has really confused me is how did it know my name? And the only explanation that I have is that maybe I was singing, or talking to myself, or talking on the phone, and I said my name. Who knows? Maybe it was stalking me. So that's my experience. Make of it what you will. But that has stayed with me ever since, and I know it always will. I'm not sure what was in the woods with me that night, but it has scared me, and it has transformed the way I think about supernatural experiences. If anyone has encountered anything similar to what I described, I would be interested to hear. Thanks for listening. Always respect the native land that you walk on. It holds so much history that you will never understand. Because of some backlash I've been getting, I'm not gonna name the place where this happened. As always, I'm not responsible for any nightmares, any scary feelings or dogs barking that might happen. This took place in the early 80s. Our tribe received a huge amount of money for housing, and a bunch of them were being built over the reservation. I remember a bunch of structures going up where no houses were at before. The only issue that we have with this is that it interrupts the natural order of things. A bunch of game trails were destroyed due to the need of housing. It was something that one family wasn't expecting, but learned that something shouldn't be disturbed. The house was just on the other side of the hill, just below the rise. The kitchen door faced to the east of it. It had a beautiful view of the sunrise in the morning, and it looked down into a valley. There is pine-covered draws on both sides of the house. The west side draws were just on the other side of the road, while the east side went down the hill to meet up with the other pine-covered hills. During construction, the local company that was hired to build it came across a few setbacks from the moment that they began construction of it. A basement was dug, and concrete was laid to form the basement walls. The crew arrived on a Monday to find that someone had thrown dirt into the basement. They assumed it was vandals with nothing better to do. They cleaned it up and started building the framework of the walls. By the weekend they had the floor over the basement completed, and at least 2 of the walls framed up. When they came back on Monday, the framed up walls were pulled down over the weekend. They put the framework back up and continued on with construction. Throughout construction, they ran into things like that. Eventually, the house was completed and the family moved in. Once the family moved in, that's when things started to happen. The family's dogs would start barking late at night, running around the house, or they would stay barking at something. The dogs would stop barking and move back to the side of the house that faced the road. At first, the husband would go outside with his oldest son to see what they were barking at. When they did, they would shine around with their flashlights in the direction of the barking dogs. A couple of times they would see some eyes shine down in the pine-filled draws about 100 yards from the house. The eye shine would disappear behind the trunks and they would hear something going down the hill. As time moved along, things began to change. On this day, the family decided to go into Rapid City, which is about an hour-and-a-half drive. The oldest son decided to stay home. It was a less than eventful day for him. He was regretting it. As soon as the sun went down and it got dark, everything changed. He was watching TV and the dogs began their nightly barking towards the east. He ignored it completely. The dogs continued to bark, but soon they began to sound scared. As they went towards the pine-covered draw, the dogs ran out from the front to the back like they always did. But this time, the dogs were barking like they were challenging something in the dark. The challenging barks went to scare barks. Then one dog could be heard yelping as it ran back to the front of the house, while the other dog kept barking, and then it gave a yelp, almost like someone had kicked it or hit it. It quit barking. Then there was a loud thump on the house. He heard the thump and went to the back of the house. He opened the kitchen door, called the dog's name. He could hear it whimpering, but he couldn't see it. That's when he saw movement in the dark. He closed the door and went to get his flashlight. He opened the door again, towards the drawer where he saw something move. In the beam of the flashlight, he saw a tall figure standing at the top of the drawer. It was 35 yards away from the kitchen door. The figure was dark, covering the light, and it lifted up its left arm, covering its eyes from the shine of the flashlight. He slammed the kitchen door, locked it, and backed up into the kitchen. Just then, there was a loud scream from behind the house. It was loud enough to vibrate through the kitchen wall. He ran out the kitchen into the living room, and there was another loud scream that seemed like it was at the kitchen door. He heard the dog that was in front of the house bark. Then he heard what sounded like the dog had been thrown towards the road. He heard it start yelping and running down the road away from the house. Just then, there was a loud thump like something had hit the south side of the house. Then, there was another bang. As he stood in the middle of the living room, the banging sounds continued all around the house, along with a low growl. He could hear it take a breath in between the growl. Every bang that happened, he would jump. It sounded like it was trying to knock a wall down. He remembered how they would come to see the progression of the house being built, and he remembered being told that the frame walls were being pushed down. The banging sounds continued for about 20 minutes along with the guttural growl. Then, there was a loud scream. Then it stopped. He stood there in the dark, listening. The last scream happened on the southeast corner of the house where his bedroom was. He stood there, hoping that it was over, and that it was gone. He walked quietly to his bedroom, stopping at every noise. He opened his bedroom door, looking carefully towards his window. His window blinds were closed, which made him feel safe. He walked around his bed and made his way to the window. When he got to the window, he wanted to look out, but at the same time he didn't want to. He stood there for a few minutes working up the courage to peek out the window. He opened the blinds just enough to look out. That's when he fought back a scream when he saw this creature, 15 feet away from his window. It was looking towards the main road. He could see that it was at least 8 feet tall, mainly because the backyard clothesline pole was about 5.5 feet tall. Its waist was even with the top of the pole. Just then, he made a noise by bumping the blind, and this creature must have took notice of him, because it turned to look towards the window. It stared at him, and then it took off running back towards the draw towards the east of the house. Just as it got to the draw, it looked back towards his window. Behind it, he saw the pine trees light up with some car headlights. As he heard the car start honking, it disappeared down into the draw. He ran out of the house, just as the parents parked their car. His mom had a scared look on her face as she asked if he was okay while his dad took off running behind the house. He just nodded, as he and his mom got his sleepy siblings out of the car and hustled them into the house. His dad came in and looked at his mom with a scared look on his face. He said that they're all gonna sleep on the living room floor tonight. She just nodded her head, made some beds on the floor. He loaded it and sat in the recliner. It was a sleepless night for him, his mom, and even for his dad. They fell asleep, but it didn't last very long. As the sun started to come up, his mom got up, picked up his siblings and moved them into his parents' bedroom. As soon as the door closed, his dad was asking what happened, and he told him everything. After he got done, his dad told him that both him and his mom had seen it in the headlights as they drove up. Then his dad went to the kitchen door and they both went outside. The sun was high enough to look around. As they walked around the house, in the dirt patches that were bare of grass, they found footprints that were about 14 inches long. As they came around the front of the house, they both heard some whimpering. They found their dog underneath the steps in the front porch. It was the one that you heard being thrown. They went around the house again as they did. They found dusty handprints on the side of the house. They both ended up walking towards the draw, but they didn't find any more footprints. As he was looking down into the draw, his father said, "Oh shit." He turned around to see that his father was looking at the roof of the house. There was the other dog. They got the ladder and climbed the roof of the house. Their dog was dead. The ribs were protruding from its side and looked like its neck had been broken as well. They both got the dog off the roof and laid it below the kitchen door. They called the police to report that their dog had been killed. When the officers arrived, they told them what happened. That's when the officers said that they don't handle that, and they called for a ranger to come to the house. A ranger got there. He just checked them out like they were crazy, but he said he would look around. He walked down the draw and came back up the draw about 20 minutes later. He told them he found tracks and he would take them down and see it. They followed him down to the prints. He went into a long story about bear tracks and he showed them the footprint that he found. As they walked back up the draw, he told them it was a random bear that had killed their dog. But everybody knew it wasn't a bear. But the way that the ranger was really pushing "it's a bear" line, they just ended up agreeing with him. The ranger just shook hands with them and left. In the years that followed, more houses were built in that area, and with them came more stories, phone calls and reports of loud noises at night, of some sort of coyotes or animals. All the families talked about this, but the rangers always offer the same explanation. But everybody knows it's not just a bear. This just shows you that some lands are not meant to be disturbed. Always respect it. I wanted to write about what happened to me and my partner in September of 2023. We were hanging with our two new friends, husband and wife. Let's say their names are John and Mary. They decided to camp at Todd Lake Recreation Center, which is in the George Washington National Forest, and they invited us to spend time at their campsite, have a few beers, relax by the campfire. My partner and I decided we weren't up for overnight camping, but we were down to hang out for a bit. The recreation center was only 45 minutes from home, so we thought we could drive it if we didn't have but a few drinks, ate food, and chill for a couple of hours. So we get there around 4:30 p.m. and we have camp snacks, chips and sandwiches, nothing too special, and some alcoholic drinks. We wandered down to the lake and let their dog swim, and then we decided to head back to the campsite and start a fire. I knew we weren't staying the night, so I kept track of how many drinks I had and the food that I was eating to make sure I was suitable for the drive later. In total, I had 5 beers the entire night. Not to sound like an alcoholic or anything, but 5 beers do not explain what happened to us that night. I can handle my alcohol, and I am responsible when drinking by pacing myself, eating food, and drinking water in between each drink. So we were hanging by the fire with John and Mary, and next thing you know, John says, "Do you guys want to go walk down to the lake?" We respond with, "Let's do it." The campsite has a short walking path to the lake, about 0.5 miles away. It should only take minutes to get there. Now, this is when it gets weird. I look at my cell phone and see it's about 8:30 p.m. and I decided to put my phone in the car before we walk down to the lake, simply because I don't want to lose it. The next thing I know, I woke up in the woods in the middle of nowhere, passed out on the ground, on a trail, with my partner in the middle of this forest, an hour away from the campsite, and John and Mary are nowhere to be found. My partner was on his back with his head turned to the side, and I was lying halfway on the moss, and the other half on him with my head turned to the side, almost as if we were placed perfectly. We were lost, and both felt extremely confused and sick. We both ended up throwing up. We walked out trying to find John and Mary's campsite. It took us about an hour to get back, and it appeared we had hiked about an hour outside of the rec center. We both had zero recollection of how we got there, why we both passed out in the middle of the woods at night, and why the hell 5 beers with food, with many hour spans in between, made us so sick and lose memory at the same time. My partner was completely confused and started screaming for help. I was begging him to be quiet, because I felt so sick and had no idea where we were. I needed a moment to collect myself, trying to figure things out, and hike out of here, out of our current situation. Now, something to know about us is that we're both hikers and backpackers and very comfortable outdoors in nature. However, at that moment, I was so thankful that I didn't wake up in the woods at night on a trail alone. Thankfully, He was with me. During this whole time, we both felt like we were being watched as we tried to find our way back. It was eerie. I was telling my partner when we were trying to find our way back to the campsite that something felt very wrong, and when we got back, we needed to get in the car and leave. I knew something was up, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what happened. We were also both in shock how we both blacked out. Now, I know what you're thinking. We were drugged. We felt that too. But why would John and Mary, our friends, drug us? And why would they drug us and carry us deep into the forest? It didn't add up. We finally made it back to the campsite, and I first opened my car and grabbed my phone to see what time it is. It was 2 in the morning. My heart sank. How did it go from 8:30 p.m. when we were walking down to the lake, which is about half a mile or less from their campsite, all the way to 2:30 in the morning? Both of us didn't like not knowing what happened to us in the lost time. So before we decided to leave, my partner knocked on their tent and said, "Hey John, we're leaving. We need to get out of here, something's off." John then replies, "Where is Mary?" And my partner and I both look at each other concerned and tell John, "What do you mean? She's not in the tent with you?" John then replies, "No, I thought she was with you two." That's when we all decided to go look for Mary. John said the last thing he remembered was we were hanging out by the fire and asked if we wanted to go down to the lake. And then hours later, he woke up underneath the picnic table at the campsite, not remembering how he got there. However, something seemed fishy, and he seemed like he wasn't concerned, almost relaxed. We found Mary down the trail to the lake, slumped over, asleep in the woods near the campsite. None of us remember what happened and why we all ended up in these places. It was misty, dark, and foggy on the mountain, and I was shivering, feeling sick, and just ready to go home. We got in the car and returned to our house, but it took a while to settle enough to sleep. When we spoke to John the next morning, he laughed it off and said, "Yeah, maybe we shouldn't drink so much next time we hang out." I remember all of us hanging by the fire, and then talking about going down to the lake, but I stayed back to deal with the dog, and you three went down there. And John switched this story from what he said the night before. Something didn't sit right with me. The Tall Lake Recreation Center was almost empty. We only saw one other family camping that night, and they were nowhere near our campsite, which was also strange. My partner and I don't feel like we drink enough to the point where it would cause us to black out, especially at the same time. So what did happen? But our only thoughts were this must have been something paranormal, or did they actually drug us? I started to get flashbacks of memory, and all I remember was John's face on the beach and then blackness. Was it something from the Appalachian folklore, like the Mothman, or some other bizarre creature? Did we all drink too much? Did we get drugged? My partner lost his phone that night, so I called the ranger the following Monday, and they said they found it in the woods busted up between campsites 5 and 6. But John and Mary were camping at campsite 1. The ranger did end up mailing it back to us. The phone never cut back on. Even though the front of the screen was perfectly intact, it was only the back of the phone that was busted. A part of me doesn't want to know what's on that iPhone. The next day, my partner was starting to feel very ill, and I was starting to shiver and get chill bumps all day. We should have just gone to the hospital, but we didn't. I never experienced anything like this, and to this day, we are skeptical about meeting new friends or having new people enter our life. Either way, we're both so grateful that we made it home safe and that we still have each other. My partner doesn't have social media, but I blocked John and Mary on mine, and we haven't seen them since then. We did move to another state in 2024, not because of this reason, but because I started dealing with a lot of mental struggles and night terrors since this occurred. And now I worry if it was John, or both of them. Are they doing this to other people? Thanks for listening. My wife, a native Navajo, invited me to go with her to her grandmother's house for Christmas. This being the first time I ever been to the Navajo REZ, I wasn't sure what to expect. I have ideas about what it might be like. Nevertheless, I was excited to go somewhere I'd never been before. Most of my excitement came from wanting to learn more about the other culture and the unique opportunity of visiting the REZ as an outsider. Because of this, I was also a bit nervous. What if I wasn't accepted? Would the people be welcoming, or would they feel a certain way about my presence? So we left our house on Christmas Eve with our dog, and we started to make the 4-hour journey to Grandma's house. On the way there, we saw a beautiful sunset scatter across the mountains. After traveling for about 3 hours, we found ourselves at the point that leads to an hour-long drive on an isolated road that would eventually take us to our destination. While we were on this road, my wife shared stories of dances and the practices that her tribe has. All of it fascinated me, and it actually left me asking more questions than I had imagined asking. By the time we arrived at Grandma's house, it was dark and cold outside. As I began to unpack the car, my wife took our dog a bit away from the house so it could go use the bathroom. By the time she got back, I had taken our bags inside and locked the car up for the night. As we sat around the kitchen table eating food that was cooked by Grandma, we shared stories and played a card game. After about an hour, we all said goodnight to one another and got ready to go to bed. At around midnight, my wife and I laid down, and I called out to the dog to go to bed. A short time thereafter, we fell asleep. I forgot to turn off the light next to the bed on the nightstand. And around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up having to use the bathroom. That's when I noticed that our dog was just sitting, looking at the door that led out to the small hallway. On the other side was the main door to the house. I called for her to come back to bed, and she just put her nose at the base of the bedroom door, sniffing while scratching, so I assumed that she also had to go outside. I walked up to the main house door and opened it, ushering her to go outside. She ended up just sitting there and staring. After trying to get her to go outside a few times, and her not wanting to go, I closed the door and made my way to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. In the kitchen, there is a big window to the right of the sink that overlooks the driveway to the house, with a bit of light that makes the driveway barely visible at night. As I put my hand to turn on the faucet, my head turned to the right to look outside. And that's when I saw it. A dog, sitting outside and staring into the house. But there was something strange about this dog. It was much bigger than a typical large breed, by 2 times. I began to get the chills and internally said to myself, fuck this. Grabbing my water and about to head back to bed, that's when I saw that the dog stood up and began to walk away. One thing that I feel I might not convey well enough is the way this dog walked. It seemed to walk very awkward and almost stiff-like. I mean, what the fuck? What kind of dog even walks like that? First of all, dogs don't even really walk. After making my way to bed, I couldn't help it, but I was just thinking about that dog. As I laid in bed in silence, I began to hear faint, weird noises coming from the darkness beyond the bedroom window. I eventually fell asleep and woke up the next morning. As I sat in the kitchen table, eating the breakfast that Grandma had gotten ready for us, I couldn't shake off the feeling of that strange encounter with the dog. Trying not to sound too alarmed, I simply asked if the neighbors had a large dog. But this question itself seemed to trigger a series of reactions from both Grandma and my wife. She gave a worried look to my wife, and they both exchanged glances. And without wasting much time, Grandma quickly stepped out of the kitchen and grabbed the old phone and began making phone calls to people that I assumed were members of their community. There was urgency in her voice,
and I could sense that something was going on. I didn't even say anything else no more, and they didn't say anything about it either. Soon after breakfast, a native priest and a medicine man arrived at the house. They also entered with some urgency and quickly began talking with Grandma in whispering tones. My wife then joins my grandma in the conversation, and they all began to look at me and talk more. Then, the priest went around the house with sage, and the medicine man comes to talk with me and Grandma about my experience. I can see the priest draped in traditional clothing, retrieving more bundles of sage from a pouch, and also going outside around the house itself. To sum it up, I had encountered something. It was a presence, and me, being an outsider, had somehow drawn its attention. My wife then said that she would be back, and she eventually returned with a bundle of raw meat. It seemed that this raw meat was an offering, part of a ceremony to ward off this thing that I had encountered. At that moment there was a ceremony held. I won't go too much into details because it's simply too much, but basically I encountered something that I shouldn't have the previous night. Nothing else happened after that. But now, whenever we visit Grandma's house, I have learned to abide by the unspoken rules that have been shared with me over the years. And so I'm telling you all this story so you all can be careful if you ever go to the REZ. Abide by these rules even if you're not in the REZ. I refrain from getting up to go to the bathroom at night. And if by chance any of us happen to witness something strange, that we should quickly speak up, not letting it linger in silence. And most of all, don't talk about these experiences with other people, as you never know who is listening. The town I grew up in was a nice place to live. We had everything any normal town had. Fast food joints, the movies, supermarkets, and we even had 2 different shopping malls. You might think that 2 malls would be a bit too much for a small town, and you would be correct. The reason our town had 2 was that the original one was getting ready to close, while the new one had just been constructed. Everyone I talked to, all my friends and family, myself included, all loved them, while we didn't enjoy the huge amounts of people who would gather inside the shops. The mall would bring out a sense of wonder in all of us. The new mall had just been built earlier this year. It was massive. It had department stores that seemed to go on forever. The food court had almost 30 different restaurants. It even came complete with the movies and ice skating rink. Though the place was very cool, it was often bombarded by people from the neighboring towns and cities, congesting it beyond capacity. Taking a walk through that mall was like trying to walk in the ocean underwater with ankle weights. It got to the point where I would prefer going to the smaller, older mall which happened to be closer to my house. The older mall was constructed in the early 90s. It also had the movies, but it was a fraction of the size of the larger one. Actually, at this point in the mall's life, the only reason to go to this mall was the small arcade and to the movies. It often amused me to think that the large building was just that, a building for an arcade with a few game cabinets and the movies with only 8 rooms or so. Malls are great, but you'll never catch me inside one after the sun goes down. It was a midwinter's day when a couple of my friends asked me if I wanted to hang out. Me, being the outgoing kind of guy that I am, I agreed. After meeting up with the 3 of them, they asked me if we wanted to hang out for a bit, then catch a movie at the old mall. I nodded, and we spent all day chilling, since school had been out for a winter vacation. At around 5 p.m., we all made our way to the mall. The walking sucked, but since all of our parents worked, and we didn't have cars of our own yet, it was really our only option. As we walked in, our feet went through a slurry of mud and ice. We joked and threw snowballs at one another the entire way there. We didn't arrive at the mall until 6:30 p.m., which wasn't an issue since our movie didn't start until 10 p.m. Walking inside the mall was like stepping inside of a rotting animal. Darkened shops littered the marble walkways. Only a few of them had their lights on, but it seemed like no one was around to maintain them. The further we walked, I noticed that they had built a sort of drywall type barrier to close off sections of the mall. Even though the sun was still out and it was setting fast, the closed sections of the mall were as black as night. The arcade itself wasn't impressive by any means, but it was nice to have something to do while we waited for our movie to start. All of us spent some time at the front row of cabinets and located games to play. I was finishing up a rather lengthy game when my friend tapped me on the shoulder, informing me about the movie. I looked down at my watch and was stunned to see that 3 hours had passed. Time truly does fly when you're mindlessly staring at a video game. So we made our way up the escalators towards the top level of the mall, where the movie theater was, and purchased our tickets. The movie was just some B-rated PG-13 horror flick, but one of our group was adamant about seeing it. When we entered the room, I wasn't surprised by how empty it was. Not only was it 10 p.m. at night, but the mall itself was pretty empty anyways. The only people we had seen while we were there was a guy behind the popcorn stand, and some guy who sat in the back of the arcade, staring at a computer screen. The movie ended up lasting around 2 hours, and we weren't exiting the cinema until a little past midnight. I'm not sure why, but stepping from the theater room into the lobby was surreal. It was like I was in a place that I shouldn't be. The lobby lights were dim, and the concession stand was completely dark. One of my friends joked about going behind the counter and swiping some candy for the road, but I guess he felt guilty and he just continued walking along with us. Standing at the top of the escalators, we had a view of the entire mall. The previously illuminated shops were all dark now, and that once pitch black closed off area seemed almost like an endless void. At this point, the only sound we heard as we stood there was the clattering of the escalators as it cycled slowly. Once we were on the ground floor, we took a moment to scan around us, noting how we were most likely the only souls in the entire mall, as another one of our group suggested we go take a look around. At first, I didn't want to get in trouble, but I was eventually convinced into going along with words like, they'll just tell us to leave, and we can just say we got lost if they find us. We walked over towards one of the sections of drywall that was put up to separate the remaining shops from the closed down area. With a slight bit of effort, we managed to slide a section out of the way for us to step through. Stepping onto the other side of the wall was a strange feeling. Earlier when I felt like I shouldn't be there, this felt even more like danger to me, as if I went from standing on a cliff to walking on a tightrope. We began our walk through the abandoned part of the mall, two of my friends using their phones as flashlights. The only sounds we could hear were the clattering of the escalators growing ever distant, and our numerous footfalls as we pushed our way further into the darkness. We took note of the shops that had been completely gutted. Shelves and debris were scattered in and out of the shop fronts. Dismembered mannequin parts were all over the floor, both inside of the stores and outside. One of my friends picked up a mannequin hand and high-fived it before sending it flying further into the dark ahead of us. The sound it made echoed across the walls before quietly fading away. We all laughed to one another before a new sound forced us to stop. It sounded like the cracking of gravel or glass being stepped on. It was such a unique and distinct sound that we all froze in place, listening for a moment. Suddenly, a clatter sounded at my feet, and we all yelped. For a second, my friend directed his phone's light towards the sound, and I stared in shock. It was the mannequin hand that he had just thrown out. Only the wrist of the hand looked cracked and warped, as if something had squeezed it before throwing it. My friend shined his light on me. but I was too busy staring at something else. It was my other friend's phone, sitting on the ground with a light shining directly upwards. I walked over to it and gently picked it up. When I did, I flashed it around me. The light danced on the dark before I saw something that almost made me vomit. It was my friend, but he was standing as stiff as a board. He wasn't facing me, but instead was looking up at something. I shifted the light slightly, and I saw something impossible. Whatever it was, it towered above my friend easily over 6 feet tall. Its face was twisted. I couldn't really make out its features, but with the number of teeth I saw, I didn't really want to. Its torso was short, but its limbs were like a spider's. Its legs were long and narrow. Its arms were dangling at its side. It didn't seem to be wearing any clothes, but instead had gray skin, with patches of black all over its body. I could feel my own body begin to seize when I saw the creature raise up a hand and rested it upon my friend's shoulders in front of him. He didn't even move as the creature touched him. He just stood there, silently. Just then, another one of my friends grabbed me by my shoulder, and I spun around in panic, almost knocking him down and dropping the phone. He told me we needed to leave right now. As I scrambled to pick the phone back up, when I turned, I flashed the light back on the spot from before, but my friend and the creature had vanished. In a panic, we all ran out of there as fast as we could. The entire trek home, we talked about what we had seen and what we thought happened to our friend. One of my friends said that he had only seen him standing there. The other one said that he could only see me in the dark holding the flashlight. And then I told him what I had seen, and if they had not been there, they most likely wouldn't have believed me. We all debated on what we should do, if we should tell our parents, or just pretend like it never happened. They were both in favor of acting like it never happened, but I couldn't just let one of my friends get hurt and not do anything about it. So about an hour after we got home, I made my way over to my friend's house, the one who was left behind. I knocked on his door, and his mom answered. I told her that I really needed to tell her something important, but just before I could find any word, I saw him, my friend, sitting at their dinner table, staring at the ground. I then asked if I could talk to him, but she said that he had only gotten home a few minutes ago and that he wasn't feeling very well. I returned his phone while I was standing there, and then I went home. I haven't talked to or even seen my friend over the next 2 weeks when suddenly I was passing by and there was a for sale sign in their front yard and also a sold sticker plastered across the sign itself. I'm not sure what happened with my friend or why his family moved. I'm not sure who or what that creature was, but I don't think I will ever go to a mall after dark again, and I would advise you all to do the same.
Going on a hike can be very therapeutic, and it's also a great exercise. At least that's what my ex-girlfriend said when she first took me hiking. It started out as just some way for us to stay in shape and spend some time together. The first time we went, I was a skeptic. I'm no stranger to exercise, but climbing up a mountain wasn't something I would consider relaxing. I remember wheezing and struggling the entire trek up the mountain. I wanted nothing more than to just go home and just lay on the couch with a bag of chips. Once we had reached the summit, I'll tell you, there are only a very few sites that can match it. During our relationship, she and I would go hiking about twice a month. We always went to the same exact spot and hiked up the same exact trail. After a few months had passed, I was no longer wheezing and was able to truly appreciate the beauty of it. I actually never really knew how incredible nature actually was. After some time, our relationship started to go downhill. We had grown apart, and it seemed like every time we speak to one another, it would end up in a screaming match. Eventually, It became one fight too many, and we ended up breaking up. I'll be honest, it was rough for me those first couple of weeks. The realization didn't fully hit me until I was stepping out of my car and onto that dirt trail. It had become such a habit that I didn't even realize I was alone. Since I had already made the drive up to the mountain, I figured that I might as well go. The first hike, doing it alone, was heartbreaking. But surprisingly, she was right. It did end up being quite therapeutic for me. Making it all the way to the top on my own, I felt empowered and decided that I wanted to continue hiking regardless. So for the last 2 years, I gone hiking twice a month, on the same trail, on the same mountain. I did, however, change the days that I would go, just in case she still continued to hike up there as well. I didn't want to deal with the awkwardness of seeing her on the trail. However, yesterday was the last time I'll ever go hiking in my life. The day started out as any other. I woke up, got ready, grabbed my pack, and drove up to the mountain. It had been raining all week prior, so I made sure to bring along a sturdy pair of boots, just in case, you know. When I arrived, I stared at the swinging sign on a metal chain. It read, "Rock slide. The trail is closed." I huffed and got back into my car. I thought about going home, and in hindsight, I should have done just that. But instead, I was adamant about maintaining my routine. I drove around to the other side of the mountain, which didn't take me very long. It wasn't that big of a mountain. I found a spot that appeared to be a clearing of some kind. It looked like an area for hikers to disembark and make their way up the mountain. As I pulled up, I saw a dirt trail leading through the trees, even though it was much more overgrown than the other path. I looked around and saw that this one had no sign, so I figured that the rock slide happened on the other side of the mountain. I grinned, inhaled deeply, and began my hike. This path was much more difficult than the other. It took me nearly twice as long to make it halfway up than it did on the other path. I ducked under branches, pushed between trees, and climbed over boulders. I was beginning to wonder if this was actually worth it when suddenly, I stepped out into a clearing. It seemed like a little pocket of nature safely preserved by the towering trees around it. There was a small stream lined with flowers running through it, with some deer scampering off in the distance. I felt some renewed energy pour into me as I continued onward. After 2 more hours of walking, I finally broke through the foliage and arrived at the top. As I stood up there, catching my air for a few moments, I looked around and enjoyed the view. I had never been on this side of the mountain before, so I wondered if I could see anything different. It didn't take me very long to notice a small cabin about halfway down the mountain, not too far from where I hiked actually. I wonder who could be living isolated up here on the mountain. As I stared at it from high above, I thought I saw something move in the trees near it. I stared a few moments longer to see if I could see it again, but there was no more movement. Then, a group of birds flew out from the surrounding trees, and I thought that must have been what I had seen earlier, just a bird. However, my curiosity wasn't fully satisfied, so I decided that upon my descent, I would try to pass by that cabin. Getting to it was much more difficult than heading back down the way I came. It was almost like the trees were blocking my attempts to get any closer. After nearly an hour of pushing my way through the brush that was in the way, I stepped out into where the cabin rested. The very first thing I noticed about it was that it appeared to be abandoned. The windows seemed to have been shattered long ago. The wood was slowly rotting away in places. The wooden front door seemed to sway and knock off the door frame, almost like a wind chime. This was obviously some hunter's cabin from long ago that had been neglected for many years. The sun was nearly behind the mountain as I stepped onto the wooden steps, my heavy boots making the wood below my feet creak painfully despite its age. I admired the carefully carved wood as I walked up to the door. I reached down and gently pulled the door open. It only let out a soft squeak of the hinge before opening fully. I peered inside, and even though it was starting to become dark outside, I could still see the interior clearly. The door opened up into a living area with racks and shelves and a small couch. I walked inside, taking care not to step on any rotting wood. To my left was the door that seemed to open to a small washroom and kitchen area, with just a passing glance that appeared to be empty. I walked down the short hallway, and there were 2 doors, both on my left and right. I opened the one on my right first. It was a bedroom. The bed had long since been overtaken by fungus and random plant life. I backed out of the room and pushed open the door on my left. I walked inside, and nothing appeared to be out of the ordinary. That was, until I saw something peeking out from behind the desk. It looked like a boot. Making my way around it, my pace slowly came to a stop. I think I had found the owner of the cabin. It was a man, or at least I think it was due to the clothing, because the skeleton still made it difficult to tell. The clothes seemed to have been torn up, most likely due to wild animals. I thought, I wonder if the person had a heart attack or some sort of accident. I then thought about how terrible it must have been to have died up here all alone. Just then, I heard a noise that sounded like the front door swinging shut. I felt my body freeze in place. I waited and listened for a minute or two. After not hearing anything, I thought it must have just been the wind blowing the door shut. I started to hear the floor creak. Somebody was in the cabin with me. I quietly backed up behind where the sturdy door opened up and pressed my back flat against it. A voice, like a ragged whisper, drifted down the hall. Hello. It sounded like an old man. I'm not sure why, but I stayed quiet and waited. Another voice, but this time it was loud. Who's out there? When I heard them say this, it sounded strange. It didn't seem like the correct way to ask if someone was inside the cabin. Just as I had this thought, the door on my left began to move slightly. It opened up, but I was still behind it, so the door just gently rested against me. I could still see around the frame, however, and whatever had opened the door was crawling on the ground. My eyes grew wide with each passing second. Its gray skin and disformed figure were unlike anything I had seen before. Long fingers with sharp nails quietly pressed into the wood in front of it. Disjointed feet pushed the rest of the body along. I remember thinking it sort of looked like that creature from The Lord of the Rings, or maybe a hairless dog. It crawled around slowly before climbing up onto the desk in the room and looked down at the skeleton. Then, that same voice sounded. Who's out there? I realized at that moment that the voice was coming from this thing. Just then, my body weight shifted and the floor beneath my feet, and the wood creaked. This thing snapped its head to me, its face with 2 gray eyes and a mouth like a cavern of teeth below. Then, it reared back and unleashed a deafening shriek at me. I quickly swung around the door, slamming it shut behind me. I dashed out of the cabin, nearly falling onto my face off the porch. My quick breathing was doing nothing to calm my panicked state as I forced my way through the trees and over the rocks. I didn't know exactly where I was going. I just knew it was down the mountain. My lungs were starting to sting in my chest, but I kept my pace up as long as I could. After nearly an hour of running, my foot slipped on a slick rock, and I fell over through brush and trees. I could feel scrapes and scratches forming on my face, as well as bruises beginning to form on my body. I came to a rest in the mud and nearly fainted. My eyes shot open a moment later as I heard a rustling of bushes. I scrambled back up and continued moving down the mountain, now with more of a limp. After nearly 10 more minutes of limping down the mountain, I exited the trees, not too far from where I had parked my car. Seeing this gave me hope I had never felt before. As I approached, I began to feel my injuries more and more. I quickly got inside my car and safely drove home. I've been laying on this couch with ice packs ever since I got home. I gave my ex a phone call this morning, and I asked her if she still hiked up on that mountain. She told me that she did, and I told her exactly what I'm about to tell all of you right now. If you ever feel like going camping or hiking up a mountain alone, don't. There's something living up there in the mountains, in those woods, something terrifying, and it's something you don't ever want to see for yourself. I've been living in the Southwest for my entire life, and I'll be the first to tell you that there isn't much going on here, even though I assume that could be said for pretty much anywhere that isn't Disneyland. To be honest, there's only two guarantees living in the Southwest: the scorching heat and the rocks. I remember my mom taking me over to the Grand Canyon when I was little, and I couldn't help but think, this is it? I wasn't excited like your average kid, but my point was still valid. It was just rocky formations and the sun bearing down overhead. Once the initial feeling of viewing the canyon went away, I just couldn't wait to get back home. Growing up, I found comfort in my friendships. While the town and landscape offered little in the way of entertainment, the friends I had made over the years made up for it. We would spend our summers riding our bikes through the various side streets and circling all the blocks. We would just be outside convenience stores on hot days. The years slipped by so quick, and before I knew it, I was sitting in a lecture hall, listening to the professor just rattle on. The college life wasn't what I had imagined. Growing up, I had heard all these stories from adults about the good times they had in college. It seemed to be far more work than play. All of my professors were demanding, and my off hours were filled with whatever part-time job I could find at the time. Lucky for me, it wasn't all that bad. One of my closest friends, Drew, had gone to the same college with me. We had most classes together, so that made it a little bit more exciting. Drew was one of the first people I had met growing up. He had moved to the neighborhood roughly a year before we began school together. We became fast friends, which could be perceived as quite strange from the outside. Drew was extremely outgoing, the type of person to always be the center of attention. Meanwhile, let's just say that I was less approachable. Looking back, I guess it's quite humorous to think about. He was very popular in school, but instead of hanging out with the plastic clique, as I called them, he would choose to hang around with me. Eventually, our group of friends grew over the years. Alan, Mikey, Logan, Nate, and Riley, and with Drew and me added into the mix, that made 7 of us. However, by the time we all graduated high school, only 3 of us lived in town. Drew and I both got accepted into the same college just outside of town, while Nate had gotten a pretty steady job working at a warehouse. Even though that seemed to take up all his time, the others moved out of town or out of the state. The end of college was quickly approaching, and during lunch one day, Drew mentioned to me that he had a job lined up for him out of state. As much as it hurt to hear, I understood and was happy for him. That of course forced me to think about my plans after college, and I quickly realized I didn't have many aspirations. I think Drew could tell by my expression that the news was somewhat heavy for me, but he assured me that everything would be fine. I ended up just returning a shrug. Before we returned to our classes, he mentioned that he was working on something that would make me much happier. My curiosity lit up as I wondered what he could mean by working on something. As the days and weeks passed, I had completely forgotten about this conversation. Until about a week after graduation, Drew messaged me and asked if I was available for an upcoming weekend. I checked my calendar, and I told him I was, but of course I inquired as to what it was about. He said he wanted to go camping, We had never gone camping before, and Drew didn't really strike me as the outdoors type. He pleaded with me that this would be really fun, and despite having a couple of reservations about it, I agreed. I made note of the weekend and marked it on my calendar. I bought what I imagined to be enough provisions for a day or two, and waited for Drew to pick me up. He arrived late in the morning on Friday, and I hopped into his car. He flashed a grin that seemed to hint like he was hiding something. I asked him what was up, but he just shook his head. We drove out of the town for a few miles before turning off onto a dirt road. The road began to go up the side of a rock formation, and we arrived at the peak of this hill. I noticed this large, flat clearing. These small mesas are not uncommon, but I was surprised that this was going to be our destination. As we rode to a stop, I noticed a few other cars in the vicinity. I immediately recognized the people standing next to them: Alan, Mikey, Riley, Logan, and Nate. Two of them were busy setting up tents while another was busy getting the fire started. I chuckled and shook my head. Drew briefly patted me on the shoulder before we both hopped out. Everyone was in great spirits, and we spent most of the day remembering about the past. We got the campsite all set up, and I began soaking everything in around the edges of the hilltop. My feelings towards this rocky terrain was much different than when I was younger. As I stood there attempting to soak in my surroundings, I noticed something off in the distance. A large dark shape was moving slowly down the hill. I tried to focus my eyes by squinting, but it wasn't helping. Nate then patted me on the shoulder and asked me if I wanted a beer. Showing the still semi-full can in my hand towards him, he nodded and began to walk away when I called him back over. I asked him to check out this weird shape on the other hill, and he stood there briefly scanning the terrain. He told me he couldn't see anything, and I began looking in the same area that I had last spotted it. Sure enough, the shape I had seen was gone. I shrugged, telling him it was most likely a wild animal or something. He gave me a weird look. I knew he was implying that I was drunk, but then he laughed and walked off. As I stood there, I couldn't stop thinking about that weird shape. In contrast to the terrain around it, it was quite large, and it seemed to crawl along the rocks. I had never seen an animal move like that before, so my brain was hyper-focused on whatever it was. I eventually pulled myself away from the cliff's edge and returned to the camp. We ate various foods we had brought along with us, and put a sizable dent into the alcoholic drinks we had brought. It wasn't long until we all retired to our tents for the night. At some point during the night, I was awoken to an odd sound. It sounded like someone was digging in the dirt outside of my tent. When I first heard this, my body initially seized up. There would be a long scrape in the dirt, followed by a stop, and then another long scrape. I thought maybe one of the guys couldn't sleep well and was just walking around outside, killing time. When I heard something new, something which sent a wave of uneasiness coursing through my veins, something was breathing next to my tent. It was inhaling sharply and allowed a very quiet laugh. The laughing is what creeped me out, only because it sounded very artificial, like it was almost mimicking a laugh. The scraping then resumed before fading off in the distance, and the sounds of nature once again filled the night air. I laid awake in my tent for a few hours before falling asleep. I then woke up to Drew patting me on the leg. I shot up in panic, nearly striking him in the process. He went backwards with his hands up, and I caught my breath and apologized to him. He then asked if I could come outside and take a look at something. I stepped out from my tent and saw everyone standing around looking at the ground. I turned and saw large scrapes in the dirt around my tent before they trailed off towards the cliff. I could feel that familiar panic rising in my chest when suddenly I heard that fake laughing again, which nearly caused me to jump out of my skin. I spun around and saw Nate with a wide smile on his face. Then, all at the same time, everyone around erupted in laughing. My fear quickly turned to madness, then subsided, and was replaced with acceptance. Mikey then appeared from behind my tent with a towel in his hand as he wiped the tears away from his eyes. After the laughing died down, Nate apologized and said he couldn't help himself. I nodded to him and accepted the joke. Honestly, it was a pretty good one. We all got back to hanging out and enjoying the day. As we sat around in our chairs, talking, the conversation circled back to the prank, and Nate asked what I thought was on the other hill. I attempted to brush them off, but they insisted. I described to them the shape, and they all tried to take a guess on what it was. Some of the ideas thrown around were coyotes or jaguars, and Mikey suggested it was most likely just a really big snake, to which we all started laughing. Later in the evening, after we all had a bite to eat, we were just about to bed down for the night when a piercing scream drew our attention. We all turned and saw Riley running towards us from the edge of the cliff in a state of panic. He managed to say he saw something over the edge of the cliff. His wide eyes darted to each of us, looking for acceptance when everyone, including myself, busted out laughing. Half of the group turned to me chuckling, and I told Riley that it was a good attempt, but it wouldn't work a second time. He then walked over to me and grabbed me by the shirt collar. He shouted at me that he wasn't joking, and I threw my hands up, attempting to push him off, when he suddenly released me. I brushed my shirt down, asking him what his problem was. When I looked back up at him, I noticed that he was no longer looking at me, but instead was looking at something past me. Everyone else became silent as they all stared in my direction as well. Slowly, I turned and saw what everyone else was looking at. There was a face just on the edge of the campfire light. It looked almost like a porcelain doll. I couldn't make out the rest of its body. I took a step backward and looked out of the corner of my eye just to make sure everyone in our group was here and that this wasn't just another prank. Everyone was right beside me, and I noticed that Nate looked more shaken than the rest of us. I turned back and saw a single hand appear into the light as it got closer to us. The arm was thin, but was nearly the size of its body. Its hand was pressing deeply into the dirt, with these fingers that came to a fine point. The fingers didn't appear rigid. They almost reminded me of the Grinch's fingers, which for some reason made me shudder. Even worse, another hand appeared, and it looked as if it was pulling its body behind it. As more and more of it came into the light, I watched this long, almost insect-like body. I did take note of something right away. As I was watching this happen, I couldn't hear a single sound from this creature. No shuffling of dirt, no fake laughing sounds. It was silent. Then I felt something touch my shoulder. Trying desperately not to scream, I looked and it was Drew. He whispered in a shaky voice that he wanted to run to the cars. I was only able to return a slight nod. Drew and I were just about to make a run for it when Logan, someone who is always quiet, screamed and began sprinting away. The creature's head then snapped to face him, and still without a sound, it darted back into the darkness, and all we saw was a large shadow blur heading towards his direction. Logan's screams were cut off, and I watched the streak of red shoot out towards us from the darkness. Droplets of blood impacted the campfire. A second later, Logan came flying into the light and hit the ground hard. He was gripping his leg, which had these massive cuts carved into it. We all scrambled to pick him up, and we dashed towards our vehicles. We threw him in the back and drove down the hill back towards town, and we didn't stop until we were at the hospital. We quickly carried him inside as the nurses and doctors took over from there. Drew and I looked down at our blood-stained hands and walked over to sit with the others. Drew was the only one of us who could somehow speak clearly. and he told the doctor that Logan had slipped off the edge of where we were camping, and that we were able to pull him back up, but he messed up his leg on some sharp rocks in the process. We were in the waiting room for a few hours until the doctor arrived and told us that he was going to be fine. He said his leg looked much worse than it actually was, which we all exhaled a sigh of relief. Just before the doctor departed, he turned and asked us again to confirm that the cause of this were rocks, and we all shakily nodded our heads at him. We thought he was going to press further, but he just nodded to his clipboard, returned a faint smile, and made a passing remark about him being lucky it was just his leg and not his head. Logan was released from the hospital after 5 days, and we all showed up to see him off home. He barely said 2 words to us the entire time. After that, one by one, everyone else went back to living their life, not even wanting to talk about that night. And just as Drew was getting his things in order, I asked him if his company was hiring. He stopped and flashed a faint, creepy smile, which upon seeing my expression, quickly shifted into a look of concern before telling me yes, they are.
For years, I was the guy you would call if you had a squirrel in your attic. I mean, to a lot of people, I'm still that guy. But over the last 20 years, I have branched out to other less common infestations. Now, I'm the guy you call if there is a haunted doll going through your attic, or a Sasquatch trampling your flower beds. I actually love my job. All the skills I have acquired have allowed me to travel across the country. I have met incredible people, and I have experienced cryptids like few have ever done before. It doesn't hurt that the pay is great, but the stories are even better. I have one short story for you now. It's more of a public service announcement than anything else, really. I have dealt with every sort of infestation from Sasquatches. You spray human urine around the area of sighting, and it will avoid the area. A demonic presence, you need to bring in a priest. Sometimes it can be tricked into inhabiting a lesser creature, like a frog. And jackalopes, it's just a bunny with some antlers. Put it in a cage and give the poor thing a carrot. But recently, there has been one cryptid that has been growing more and more invasive into human settlements. It's called the hide behind. Most commonly found in the forests of the North United States and Canada. The hide behind is one cryptid that cannot easily be dealt with. In fact, I'm not sure it's even possible for one of these to be bagged and tagged like we normally would with other creatures. To my knowledge, no hide behind has ever been killed, maimed, dazed, or even simply removed from a residence. Once it has made a claim to an area, whether it be a local forest, a cave, or even, in one specific bloody case, a Bass Pro Shop, it will actually defend that area to the death. It was first documented by the Native Americans, then by the lumberjacks in the PNW of America. The hide behind is one of the lesser known but cryptids on the continent, but without a doubt, one of the most dangerous. No one really knows what they actually look like. As the name suggests, as soon as they are seen, they quickly duck out of view to hide behind anything in the vicinity. Out in the wild, this would be trees and rocks. In your home, this could be a corner, a kitchen cabinet, a TV, or literally anything else they can manipulate their body to hide behind, an object of any size. In the few accounts of the sightings we have on record,
They have been described as everything from a large bear, lion hybrid, to a frail and elderly woman with long arms and rashes on her skin. Because of this wide discrepancy in their descriptions, they are believed to be shapeshifters that can change their shape based on what they believe will best get their potential victim to come closer and investigate the sighting. I don't know why the hide-behinds are moving into suburbs. I guess destruction of their natural habitat, but it is becoming a real problem. That's why I'm going to share the story with you now, so you know what to do if one ever shows up in your home. I pulled up to Tim's house around 12 p.m. on a Tuesday. He had called in to tell us there was a demonic entity in his house. He wanted us to remove it ASAP. They always demand ASAP. Tim had nothing going on, but people are just so much more demanding now than they were 20 years ago. I took a quick look around the house, and it was pretty apparent there wasn't any sort of demon in its residence. Not only was there no reaction to the holy water and Ouija board I had brought with me, but Tim also didn't have normal symptoms of a demon haunting him, bad dreams, sleep paralysis, or the witnessing of any telekinetic events. After further questioning, he described what he had seen in more detail. He said, "First, I was sitting right there on the couch watching TV when I got the feeling I was being watched. I turned my attention to the screen door, and for just a second, I saw a bear looking in through the screen. But it wasn't a bear, you see. A bear would have just kept on staring at me, or keep poking at the door. But this thing just ducked out of view as quick as can be, like it was trying to sneak up on me, and I had caught it in the act. But I just grabbed my gun, set it on my lap, and kept on watching the TV, and eventually that feeling, like I was being watched, just kinda melted off. It was all peaches and cream until she showed up a few days later. This she that Tim was referring to was a new human form that the hide-behind was taking. I assume it was because of the lack of a reaction to the bear form it had previously shown itself as. Like I said earlier, the hide-behind wants you to look for it, to come near. Like the anglerfish, it dangles something in front of you, attempting to bring you closer. It's a lazy hunter. Tim then continued, "I was out in the garage in my workshop, and that feeling came over me again. That being watched feeling. I turn around, and I'm looking out the garage door, but I don't see anything. But then out of nowhere, I see a lady's head and shoulder pop out from the corner of the garage. And the second that she sees me looking at her, she pops right back around the corner where she came from. Well, this time, I went looking around for her. So I had seen crazy people, and she looked crazy, and I didn't want her grabbing me. So I gave a wide berth around that corner, and there was no one there. I walked all around the house, and I didn't see anyone, not even footprints. Tell me that's not demonic." It wasn't demonic. It was a hide-behind, and I told the man as such. I told him living out here on the edge of town made him an easy target for it. I told him that there really isn't any way to get rid of them or scare them off. I told him he could try to leave his house for a year at minimum, and maybe, with luck, it will leave on its own. But the best bet would be for him to burn the place down and never come back. He didn't like that answer. My family lived in this house for 3 generations. I'm not leaving, and I sure as hell ain't burning nothing down. I'll tell you what though, I'm gonna keep my shotgun on me, and when I get that feeling again, I'm gonna shoot it. It works for bears, and that's the meanest thing around these parts. I don't see why it wouldn't work for this. what you call it, hide behind. You can't argue with anyone over the age of 65. People get set in their ways. Their beliefs calcify. So instead, I was honest with him. I told him two things. The first thing I told him was that eventually, he'll get that feeling that he was being watched, and he'll get his gun, and he'll start looking around for the hide behind, only he wouldn't find it. That's what happens in all these cases, because at that point, it found the best hiding spot it can possibly get, the only place you won't be able to lay eyes on it, directly behind you. And at that point, it's too late for you. The second thing I told him was that I'll be back in 2 days, and more than likely, he'll be dead. And then, that's when I left. 2 days later, I pulled my van up to Tim's driveway to find the screen door open and blowing in the wind. I didn't even need to cross the threshold of his house to find him. He was everywhere. On the floor, the ceiling, the walls. The smell was unbelievable. I poured some gas on the front porch, and then I used a match to light it. The house was an inferno within 30 seconds. I got in my van and started to pull out of the driveway, and I took one last look at the house, and then beyond, out in the tree line where I saw, for just a split second, a young boy, before he quickly pulled back and disappeared behind a thin, little tree. I was hundreds of miles away by lunchtime. I say all of this to you, if you ever think you might have a hide behind in your house, or even in the area, leave. Burn the place down if you can, so nobody can move into it. These things are like bears. If they know they can get food someplace, they are just gonna keep coming back. And if you get the feeling that you're being watched and you can't figure out why, call your loved ones, because it's standing directly behind you. If you're reading this, congratulations. I'm most likely dead, or maybe worse. My name is Daniel, and I own quite a bit of land up in the Appalachian Mountains, left to me by my great auntie. So far, in the years I lived here, paranormal and downright disturbing things have happened to me here. People told me to just leave or report it, like I never done that before. To them, I'm just a young guy that went crazy a little too early. It bothers me that normal people have no idea what goes on up here, all alone. You see, my first encounter with them, I didn't know how to deal with them. I didn't even know what they were called until recently. It's important, or at least it's important to me, that some of the tricks I have learned throughout the 3 years I lived up here could be of use to somebody one day. My second, or maybe third time I was being stalked by a skinwalker, it felt like I was walking in circles. I had a camera with an SD card pretty deep in the woods, but when I tried to walk back to my cabin, I kept passing the camera. I was walking in circles. This went on for hours. The sun was setting soon, and I was quite thirsty at the time, I remember. I sat up against the tree my camera was mounted on, and actually started crying. It was watching me, I guess waiting for me to fall dead. I hit myself in desperation a few times, trying to think. I sat up and took a very deep breath, wiped the water from my eyes, and it dawned on me. It's gotta be messing with my equilibrium. I have to be off balance, there's no other way, but I could still walk. But my depth perception was slightly off. All I had to do was tilt my head as far as it would go into my shoulder and walk back to my cabin. My ear was pressed into my shoulder, but even with one ear, I could still hear how anxious the creature sounded, pacing in the woods, hoping I didn't get away. Once I made it inside my cabin, I didn't come out for a couple of days for safe measures. Another trick they know is mimicking animals. I found that they like coyotes. I actually used to hunt coyotes back home, but never up here in the mountains. I seen a couple of my deer cameras that it looked like right after I left my camera, a coyote would follow me a while, if not all the way home. I had to stop that real quick and set out some snares. All the snare would and could do is jam the coyote's legs into the mechanism until a button is pressed, and then it could be unlocked. I set out a couple of them, but also rubbed some white ash on all the traps, and sure enough, the next time I started walking back from my camera, I hear the sound of one go off. I quickly ran back to where I had laid the traps with a gun drawn, and all that was left was the trap in 3 separate pieces and the scent of burning hair in the air. Every time I checked the camera after that, a coyote with a nasty burn scar on its leg would stop where the camera was mounted and turn around and walk back into the brush. And lastly, do not engage in any type of combat with them. Warding them off is one thing, but actually hunting them is a mistake. I wish I would have known that sooner. I had 2 buddies back in town I used to tell my stories to. Alcohol loosens the lips. Their names were James and Cole. I'm pretty sure they were cousins, but I never asked. Thinking about it now, I wish I would have gotten to know them better. But long story short, they're dead. And now, I'm dying. This morning, they came and pounded in my door insisting we hunt these skinwalkers. I told them it was a very bad idea, but they even took the liberty of buying silver bullets. They told me how much they cost, but I can't remember right now. I finally caved and we got ready all day. We first started making a large amount of white ash, cleaning our guns. Heck, they even packed MREs and special high dollar spotlights. We set off right as the sun went down. We weren't 3 hours in when disaster struck. We were all sitting around a tree. I could tell that the skinwalkers were watching us. They're all around us, multiple. I'm scanning everything with my spotlight, not even realizing that Cole wasn't with us anymore. I asked James where he was, but he didn't seem nervous at all, and told me he may have had to go pee. I turned back to face my front, and there I see Cole. He's a good distance out, but something wasn't right. He was contorting in ways a human could never. I started to turn around to ask James what we should do, but halfway around, I heard James, guttural, sounding, breathing, like his lungs were filling with blood. I couldn't stand to be there anymore, and booked it back to the cabin. The forest seemed like it was laughing at me. In my desperation to run home, I knocked my flashlight running, and it was slowly getting dimmer and dimmer. I eventually had to ditch it and use some of the flares that Cole and James brought. I pulled the top off and struck it against a tree, and the red flame lit up the surrounding forest. There were so many of them, 10, 20, maybe more. But as luck would have it, they never attacked me. I could see the cabin and flung the door open and shut it behind me. I ran for the upstairs bedroom and quickly got into the old wooden closet where I'm currently typing this. I don't hear them, but they're outside my house. Unfortunately, in the midst of running away, I did end up getting clawed, or maybe bit. It's not a terrible wound, but it's bleeding black. If you're reading this, if you can, please send help. I really do need it this time. This story comes from Gallup, New Mexico. Family members are inside their home and getting ready for bed. All of a sudden, the dogs outside start raising a ruckus. The man of the family, including an uncle and some nephews, go outside to investigate, concerned about coyotes getting into the hen house. They think they see something moving about within the trees to the back of the house. The uncle picks up a handful of rocks and throws one after another into the trees. However, they hear or see nothing further outside of the ordinary, and so they end up returning to the house. With everything normal, the night is quiet and the dogs have stopped barking. They decide it's safe to go into bed. Just then, they hear a loud rustle from the trees, from the limbs whipping and branches snapping. They rush back out to the yard. All is quiet again. For 30 minutes or so, they stand guard, but not even the wind is blowing. The next morning, they go back outside and see that the gate to the hen house, as well as the door, is wide open. All of the birds are gone. The man ends up searching the yard, and out by the outhouse, they discover, instead, an odd set of tracks going back and forth, as if something upon 2 feet was pacing between there and the trees. Finding no signs of the chickens, they return to the area around the hen house to look for similar tracks, knowing that only one person or someone similar could have opened the gate and the door. But the only marks they find are within the pen, and they all belong to chickens. The grandmother, who is standing at the back door of the house, tells them that it was a skinwalker. She says a prayer, and together they yell in a loud voice and in Navajo, "Go away, go bother someone else." It all started when summer came, and me and my 3 friends, Leah, Kathy, and Jennifer, were all planning to go camping. Leah asked her dad if he could drop us off, and he agreed. When the next day came, we started heading up. Leah's dad had set up the camper that we were using. He told us there were some spare blankets inside, in case we got cold. Leah's dad finally got into his truck and turned around. He stopped and rolled down his window and said, "No boys," to all of us. He then gave us a smile to let us know he was joking with us, and drove off. There was 3 rooms, 1 master bedroom, and 2 rooms with bunks. Each room had a TV in it, so nobody cared what room they got. Everyone knew that Jennifer didn't like small rooms, so we ended up letting her have the big room. I was in the room with Leah, and Kathy was in a room by herself. I started unpacking when we heard a loud noise outside. "Leah, did you hear that?" "Hear what? That noise?" We both looked at each other, startled, and then continued unpacking. But something seemed off. It was the fact that Leah was so chill about it. I was done unpacking, so I walked outside and started a fire. Jennifer walked out, and then she asked if I saw it. I responded with, "Saw what?" That's when she started freaking me out. She then started staring at me, but behind me, panicking. Her eyes darted back and forth, and then she was calm. I felt as if something was watching me, so I turned around, and I saw an orb in the corner of my eye, reddish, black, but by the time I turned around to fully look, it was gone. I was so freaked out, because we were in the middle of nowhere, you can say, and it was only the 3 of us, by ourselves. I then told Kathy that she could cook instead. We had her family's secret recipe of shepherd's pie, and a bunch of vanilla cupcakes. There were about a dozen cupcakes left in the open box, so we just left it on the table and went to bed. I could hear the TV coming from Kathy's room, so I punched the wall and told her to be quiet. Right after I said it, everything went quiet. But then, there was a small scream in the distance. It didn't sound human. It gave me chills that ran down my spine. But I ended up dozing off. But then, I woke up in the middle of the night, hearing noises, like if someone was in the kitchen. I wake up Leah, and then we walk out into a small hallway that led into the kitchen. We saw Jennifer sitting on the table, just staring straight ahead, with Kathy being right behind me. We were looking at her, and Jennifer was making weird noises, weird sounds. She was really creeping us out. She never did this or stared into space this often. But then I noticed something in the corner of my eye. It was a shadow. It was staring at Jennifer, and then it slowly turned to face me and Kathy. I froze. Kathy froze. Then Jennifer looked at us as if she was being mind controlled. And then this figure or shadow ran out the window, and Jennifer dropped her head into the table. We were trying to wake her up afterwards, but she wouldn't wake up. This experience still scares me to this day, and it is only one of the creepiest things I have ever seen. Me and the others are still very close friends. We even live together now. But we all remember that night and whatever it was that we saw. It turns out that Jennifer remembers seeing it in the daytime, but she says she doesn't remember anything when nighttime came and when we saw it. It freaks us out even more now, knowing that our friend wasn't even awake and staring into space with her eyes wide open. So I want to first say that I don't know much about skinwalkers and other creatures of similar nature. I just now started learning of their potential existence. So now I'm willing to learn and be educated even more on these topics, especially ever since I came across something at night. There's this park my girlfriend and we used to go to smoke there a lot, and we encountered this same dog-like thing multiple times, and it was always at night. It looked like a really huge black dog with round bear-like ears and yellowish eyes. The first few times we saw it, we didn't think much of it, but then we noticed that it kept just like spawning in. It never made a sound, and it always just stared at us, and it would follow us around the park in a creepy way. And just an FYI, we encountered this dog while we were high and while sober on many different occasions. Anyways, we ended up not going to that park no more. But before we stopped going, one of the creepiest things that's ever happened to me happened at that park. We were walking from the parking lot to the park, and we would just see this thing emerge from behind a tree and follow us and try to block our path back to the car. Sometimes we had to run and jump a fence just to get away from it. We never had a single dangerous interaction outside of this one time we were at the deepest corner of the park that was bordering a small forest, and we had to jump about 2 fences to avoid that thing. I do have a theory. It could be a stray, but it really did not act like a dog at all. It didn't even feel alive. I felt like it was just actually watching us for some reason, but it was really eerie. My mother is visiting my brother's family just east of Nevada. My brother and his wife have a night out, and mom's watching over the kids, who are 3 and 5 years old at the time. She has just gotten them off to bed and goes into the living room to watch her programs. She nods off in front of the TV and is awakened around 11:30. She says that she hears whistling, not the bored, absent-minded kind, but by someone who is really good at it. She finds it strange that someone would be outside at this time of night, not only whistling, but seemingly close to the house. She goes over to the picture window. The moon is bright, the reflection casting a pale glow upon the rooftops of the nearby houses that are on the reservation. When suddenly, dogs from the neighbors all start barking at once. They sound scared, and they are barking like if it's a warning. Despite the noise, she now hears a different whistle, the kind of police use or sports officials, and it's coming from there, by the road, which runs along the side of the house. She puts on her robe and goes out to the porch and around to that side of the house. There in the road is this guy, who when he notices her standing there, says that he's the local medicine man. He holds up his whistle like it's some kind of badge. He then tells her there is a skinwalker running through the neighborhood and that she should go back inside and lock the door. My brother finds out the next day from the neighbors that there was a critter of some sort jumping from one roof to the next. So anybody listening to this, if you ever hear whistling out at night, don't go outside. If you hear any noises outside your window at night, don't go outside. And whatever you do, don't ever say a word or whistle back. I'll tell you something that is true and real. My grandpa lived in Utah. He always told me stories about skinwalkers and how they could take the form of any animal or anyone that you know. I asked him one day if he had ever met one. He told me that he did, a long time ago when he was, and he said, young and foolish. It was long before I was born, or even my mother. He explained that he had gone to the valley. He called it Skinwalker Valley. He said it was a valley where nothing living ever ventures out, and where even crows, the guardians of death itself, won't go. It's a place of darkness and evil. He told me he went out there one day because he wanted to show others there was nothing to fear, nothing but city superstition. He said he went out there in his old pickup truck, red in color but faded. When he found the valley, he saw that the grass on the ground and all of the trees were black. He said that the trees were still living though, and not far from where he exited his truck, he said there was a house. It was very old. The roof had fallen in, and the door was gone. When he got closer to it, he said he noticed what looked to be deep scratches or claw marks on the side walls. He also described seeing the scattered bones and partial skeletons of animals all over the place, as if he had wandered into some sacred burial ground. As he is standing outside the house, he dares not to go in. He hears the voice of his grandmother, but she had died some time prior. Then there were other voices. They were calling to him, calling for his life, his skin, his blood, and even for his spirit and soul. He knew them to be the voices of the lost, those who could change from man to beast. He quickly ran back to his truck, convinced that he was being pursued every step of the way. Right after that, and for some time to come, he would find possessions of his, even if they were brand new and unused, broken, torn, missing, or even, as was the case with some of the family's animals, dead. It even got to the point where he wouldn't let his dog stay outside at night. And to show me that he wasn't lying, and he made me promise I wouldn't tell my mother, he pulled up his shirt and showed me these deep and ugly scars along his back. He told me that they were made by the claws of the Skinwalker that chased him back to his truck. His only warning to me was to never look a Skinwalker in the eye. If you do, it will never forget you and mark you for life. It will have your soul. My grandfather passed away recently. At his ceremony, my uncle laughed in a way that was kind of uncomfortable. Joked that he always thought my grandpa was a Skinwalker himself. I'm having a hard time remembering the stories told to me by my Navajo family, but when I Skype with them again, I will ask. This creepy set of events happened directly to me. So here goes. My first personal encounter. It's lengthy, but hey, Skinwalkers, they require a backstory. It started when my two brothers, David and Luke's girlfriend, Sarah, all drove down to the desert to spend some time in the country. This is a reservation land, as it were, so there was red dirt everywhere. Southern Utah, a beautiful place if you ever get a chance. We had some pistols and decided to go out and do some target practice. We took our gear and some old targets to a place called Devil's Heartbeat. I had never been there, but all three of them were familiar with the area. It was a canyon about 200 feet deep. We stayed on one end of the canyon. About 50 feet over, the opposite side of the canyon rose up above us, Anasazi ruins. The Navajo may disagree with historians on the Anasazi's origins and departure. According to Navajo legend, they simply disappeared from existence, leaving behind plates, dishes, and food, and went into another dimension, or some equivalent. But whatever the history, the Navajo do not like to wander in Anasazi ruins. I have never asked why, but I figured it has something to do with disrespect, preserving history, etc. As such, none of the others cared a bit about these canyon ruins. They were more interested in shooting pistols. I could see old beds and even cave drawings on the cliffs with my naked eye, and I got this strange fixation on going over there. I'm not Navajo, and I felt that their rules didn't apply to me. I set off down the cliff without rope and decided I would climb down, cross the canyon floor, and then climb back up. This was a bad idea for a million reasons, but it was somewhat of a obsession. I can't explain the feeling. It was like magnetism. I wanted to be in those ruins, and it wasn't just some tourist-like curiosity. It felt like I was meant to go there. I kept slipping and getting stuck on the rocks, and I was so frustrated I almost started crying. Finally, I was deterred by the unmistakable sound of a growl coming from the canyon floor below me. There were trees down there, so I couldn't see what was making that noise. A mountain lion immediately rose to mind, and I got my ass back up to the cliffside. I said nothing to the others, and we shot the guns for a while. The only other strange occurrence was while Sarah was aiming, things got really quiet. We all heard a sound from behind us, maybe 20 feet away. It was almost like a growl, then a hoarse laugh, almost like a lion, and then a hyena. We had a clear view of the entire area, and there was nothing there.
At least, not on the cliff tops, where we heard it anyway. The creepy part was that while David, Sarah, and I all heard it from a close distance, Luke heard the exact same noise right by his ear. We ended up camping out there to see if anything would happen. And this is when I got completely terrified. Before, I was only scared of wild animals. Even though we had guns, we were sleeping with no bags or tents. All we had were some blankets under the stars and a little fire. So I felt safe when we all lay down. I fell asleep pretty quickly, but woke up a few hours later to see everyone else laying down with their eyes open wide, listening. The canyon was completely full of noises. The only way to describe it is people banging rocks together. There would be one set, maybe 300 yards away, then another clacking 200 yards away, and then 50 yards away. The canyon echoes, so it was hard to tell exactly how many rock smacking rock noises there was, but they sounded like Morse code. We listened to this for maybe 10 minutes. No other animal noises. Nothing. Finally, David, who is kind of a hard ass and the least superstitious of his family, shouted, "Shut up!" And everything, I mean everything, immediately stopped. My heart was in my throat. We just sat there and stared at each other, wide-eyed. It was dead quiet. And then another super weird noise from the Anasazi ruins. I don't know how to explain this one either, but it sounded kind of like a zebra noise, like these squeaky thrills. It got louder, and then the rocks, sticks, whatever started up again. But this was worse, because now other animal noises came. We heard what sounded like wolves or coyotes barking, monkeys screeching, owls hooting, and through it all, that terrible zebra noises. We said nope and got our happy little asses out of there immediately. It took us maybe 10 minutes to douse the fire, pack our blankets, and speed away, and the noises continued that entire time. That night, I was obviously pretty shaken up. Before I could fall asleep again, my Navajo mother came and sat by me, and she said that she could tell I had a rough day. We hadn't mentioned the creepy shit to avoid a lecture about fucking with the spirits. She asked me about it, and I ended up spilling my guts about not seeing the canyon ruins. It was something personal, it felt like. I wanted to go there. Why couldn't I go there? It would have been beautiful. After I told her all about it, I could see that she had a really concerned look on her face. "What is it?" I asked, totally confused, and she explained something I had no idea about. The spirits in the ruins like to draw people up. When they get up on the ground, the spirits push them off. That's why we don't go there. I remained creeped out for the remainder of the visit. Fast forward a few weeks later, I worked at a shitty call center in Salt Lake City, third shift. It was my first night being alone, and I was feeling jumpy. My brothers already warned me that I had a skinwalker following me, but I, of course, didn't believe it. I don't smoke, but I follow my coworkers out for smoke breaks because I like to chat. Tonight, I lurked in the doorway because I had this horrible cloud of dread hanging over me. I was peeping out the glass door and being a total weirdo. It hit me then how paranoid I had been, and that's when I remembered that's what skinwalkers do. They mess with your mind. While I was pacing in front of the glass door, I decided that this whole thing was fucking stupid, and I was gonna go outside and stand there for the rest of my 10-minute break. Most of the smokers were already filling back in, but I walked out and put my hands in my pockets, looked at the sky, looked in the building, mentally patting myself on the back for not being a pussy. Then I saw something that I will never, ever be able to give a rational or even halfway accountable explanation for. We have like 6 parking lots, and one of the lots far away from me, maybe around 100 feet, I could see something walking. It was a dog, obviously, but it was almost limping and walked like it was tired or hurt. Me being the animal lover, forgot all about skinwalkers, and I started walking towards it, making the "come here doggy" noises, and then I stopped. That's when I saw it. The dog had the body form of a greyhound, and it was gray, but there was something very wrong with it. It had bloody legs, and it was limping, but it walked more like a person would, on feet and hands. Its butt was moving to and from, if that makes any sense. When it heard me getting close, it just stopped without turning, something I had never known any dog to do. And finally, it looked over its shoulder at me, and this is the freaky part. This dog was looking at me the way a person does. It had huge eyes, way too big for a greyhound, and its teeth were barred like it was considering biting me. Then it growled, but it was like a whistle growl, noises no animal makes. It almost sounded like it wanted to talk, or like if it was taunting me. Somehow, in the middle of all this, I realized it didn't have a tail. And I knew and heard from all the Navajo stories that skinwalkers, when they appear as animals, don't have tails. Forgetting all logic and rationality, I turned and took off. I didn't look back until I was back inside the building and had pulled the door shut behind me. And by then, when I looked, of course, the fucking thing was gone. When I described this to my brothers, they were absolutely sure it was a skinwalker, and they went through the trouble of blessing me, my apartment, blessing them and their apartments. I never saw the creepy bloody dog again, and I have never, since even slightly, wanted to visit the cliff ruins. Just to give some background, this happened in the mountains, near El Cerro de Tomé. Okay, so Friday, 1:28 a.m., me and my friends decided to go for a drive. We sometimes like to go to the Llano, mountains near El Cerro, to experience something that only happens in that area, paranormal and supernatural. Like any other time we do this, we go in my car and drive past Dome Hill, going towards the mountains, and park across from VHS. Then we sit and take in the scenic beauty of the dark desert. We started by listening close to anything and looking everywhere, being hyper observant. At first, we saw a light in the distance, getting within about a mile away from us, then disappearing altogether. We then decided to move on from there because we had to, and I mean had to, see something else. We were driving through roads and flying by at least 30 miles per hour over the speed limit. We then turned down a familiar road. This is the road we knew that something was about to change me and everyone else. It was 4 of us in total. We looked to the right side of the car, saw what we all believed to be something like a hellhound or maybe a skinwalker, when this massive black dog just launched at my vehicle while I was going 45 through the road. We should have felt impact from this massive creature,
but we didn't. We then stopped the vehicle, and both people in the back seat looked and saw this thing rise up from the ground. It rose up from the ground and stood straight up on two legs, absolutely huge. It was all black with red eyes that are forever imprinted in our minds. I then slammed on the gas and we sped up to about 55. We took off so fast, and as I looked in my rear view mirror, I could see it. Huge fucking coyote standing on two legs looking at us as we're driving away. I had only 2 encounters with a skinwalker, both at our house in Window Rock, Arizona. By the way, we are Navajo. The first encounter was when I was playing around with the PlayStation. My sister and her boyfriend are on the couch. The front door is wide open. There's no screen door. It is nighttime, summer, and hot. I put the game down and feel compelled. I don't know why, but I just walk out onto the porch. At first, I don't notice anything out of the ordinary, but I do feel a bit anxious. As I turn to come back inside, out of the corner of my eye and to the far side of the yard, I see this figure, dark against dark, moving across the lawn. I then catch the smell of rotten meat. I call into the house for my sister and her boyfriend. They come outside as well, and the 3 of us watch as this critter gets up on 2 feet, strolls into the trees at the edge of the property, and paying us no mind. It then disappears into the dark. Moments later, and off in the distance, we hear this chanting. It's in Navajo, and it sounds as if it's coming from everywhere at once, and then it just stops. My second encounter happened about 2 years after the first one. I'm outside in our backyard, in the same property, but it's later in the day, but not quite night. The sun is still out, but it's a bit orange in the sky, and just below the tops of the trees to the west. Way out at the end of the property, where we have these bushes, and just before the woods, I see this figure. It's crouched down and looking at me. Then it just stands, but it's not very tall, not even 5 feet. At first, I think it's a man, but from what I can tell, it's not wearing any clothes. And if it is naked, it isn't skin and bones, not like any person I have ever seen. But before I could call out or anything else, it turns and lopes off, very awkward, with its shoulders rolling from side to side and its arms hanging way too low. This story comes from Gallup, New Mexico. Family members are inside their home and getting ready for bed. All of a sudden, the dogs outside start raising a ruckus. The man of the family, including an uncle and some nephews, go outside to investigate, concerned about coyotes getting into the hen house. They think they see something moving about within the trees to the back of the house. The uncle picks up a handful of rocks and throws one after another into the trees. However, they hear or see nothing further outside of the ordinary, and so they end up returning to the house. With everything normal, the night is quiet and the dogs have stopped barking. They decide it's safe to go into bed. Just then, they hear a loud rustle from the trees, from the limbs whipping and branches snapping. They rush back out to the yard. All is quiet again. For 30 minutes or so, they stand guard, but not even the wind is blowing. The next morning, they go back outside and see that the gate to the hen house, as well as the door, is wide open.
All of the birds are gone. The man ends up searching the yard, and out by the outhouse, they discover, instead, an odd set of tracks going back and forth, as if something upon 2 feet was pacing between there and the trees. Finding no signs of the chickens, they return to the area around the hen house to look for similar tracks, knowing that only one person or someone similar could have opened the gate and the door. But the only marks they find are within the pen, and they all belong to chickens. The grandmother, who is standing at the back door of the house, tells them that it was a skinwalker. She says a prayer, and together they yell in a loud voice and in Navajo, "Go away, go bother someone else." This event happened just south of Polaca, Arizona, within the Navajo reservation. A pair of skinwalkers, they say, an old couple that lived deep back in the reservation, were seen lurking around this small cattle ranch. 2 heifers had disappeared recently, one of which was discovered down by the creek and mutilated. The man who owned the ranch, his 2 sons, and his brother armed themselves and went out to try to run them off. One of the sons, not yet 18 years of age, was searching out beyond the barn when a dark shape, materializing from the darkness itself, loomed up in front of him, almost nose to nose. As the boy attempted to raise his rifle, the figure raised its hands up to its face as if it was going to yell something. The boy, trying not to look at it in the eyes, then felt something rush into his face, like dust or sand. Even though he tried not to, he ended up taking a breath, and some of it was inhaled in. Immediately, things went dark, and he started experiencing hallucinations. The others found him only minutes later, on his knees, holding the sides of his head, and his eyes rolled back. He fell to the ground and went into some sort of trance. His body limped, and he became unresponsive. They carried him back to the house, and they summoned the local medicine man, who came and said some prayers over him, but he told the others there was nothing to be done but to wait for the dust, traces of which were still on his face and his shirt, to wear off. He promised he would come back the next day when the sun was up and bless the Hogan. Later, after he had regained consciousness, the boy swore to the others that he was the victim of a dog-faced creature. He described it as not quite as tall as he is, thin and scraggly, with patches of mangy and dark hair, a canine snout only shorter than a dog's, and with the smell of rotten eggs or worse. He said he doesn't recall anything more before passing out, other than not being able to breathe and having no control over his own body.